JavaScript is based on Java and C languages, so if you have any prior programming experience, many of the control structures and language syntax would look either very familiar or identical. JavaScript is a dynamically typed, weakly typed object-oriented programming language. We will learn about what each of those things mean and what are their implications on our coding. Before we do, I'll be using Node.js to run my coding sandbox here. If you want to follow along, you can either clone the sandbox repository and follow the instructions in the README file, or you could use one of the free online prototyping applications such as Code Sandbox, GSBin, or GSFiddle. Unlike Java, which is a statically typed language, you don't need to specify the type of your variable at the time that you're declaring it like this. Dynamically typed language means that the type information is associated with the value, not the variable that contains it. So all we need to do to declare a variable is to create that container using the const, let, or var keywords, like so. Or don't mind the error here, it's basically saying that this identifier has already been used in declaring a variable and it cannot be reused again. Being a dynamically typed language basically means that the type information is acquired at the runtime instead of the compile time. As a matter of fact, JavaScript doesn't even need a compiler. Being a weakly typed language means that the variables are not bound to the type. How is that different from what we just said about the type information living with the values, not the variables? In JavaScript, you may have a variable that starts with storing a number, but then it changes later on to store some other data type. Let's look at this example. So here we have let some variable equal 20. I could do some mathematical operations here, so I would say that some variable now equal the previous value plus 20. And that will equal to 40. I also could use the shorthand operator here, so I would say that some variable plus equal 5, and now it's 45, and everything is working as expected. But then later I could decide that I want to store a string in that variable instead. So I would do some variable equal, now I contain a string, and that would work and would not break your application. Strong dynamically typed languages such as Python, for example, would allow you to declare variables without specifying the type, but once the variable has been initialized with the value, that would be the type of the variable. Up until 2015, we've only had one way of declaring variable, and that was the var keyword. But that had a few issues. Let's see what I mean. This will print out the values from 0 to 9, so let's now see if we can actually access this value of I after the loop. So if I do after loop, and I'm gonna do I like this, we're actually able to see the value. This is counterintuitive to almost everyone. You would not expect to be able to reach the value of I from outside the loop scope. And that was the issue with using vars. Vars were only constrained by one scope, that is the function scope. So if I wrap this whole thing inside a function, and I'll call it looper, and I'll move my implementation to the inside of this function, then call it over here, I'm still getting the same results. However, if I move the console log to the outside of that scope, and let's change this to after looper, and run the function again, I would get a reference error that says that the I is not defined. Outside of the function scope, we're not able to access the value of I. When ES 2015 came to life, it introduced a couple of new ways of declaring variables. That was const and let, which are the recommended way of declaring variables. I set up a linting rule to not allow the usage of vars. And I also set up my Visual Studio Code setting to always fix my linting errors. Now if I go back to my code and save the file, it would automatically update all my vars to lets. And if I move this for loop outside of the function now, and let's save this and save the file, I'd still get the same reference error that says that the I is not defined or is not accessible in that scope. So now if I use the let keyword or the const keyword, then my variables will be block scoped. So any variable that is declared within an open and closed curly brackets would only be accessible from within those curly brackets. With that said, we're ready to create variables and learn about the different data types that we have in JavaScript.